There are three different gauges that I want to focus on in this video. And we're going to kick things off with the circular gauge. Drag it onto our screen, and we are presented with the source tag menu. Let's just choose a temperature tag. The circular gauge can have its height and width adjusted by clicking and dragging on the screen. Or if we go into properties, we can manually edit the X, Y coordinates. The scale low and scale high values will help us format the circular gauge, and it makes it easier to visualize the data, while the major interval sets the interval spacing and the number of values for the gauge. Because we can see the value of our tag is already exceeding the scale maximum, let's bump this up to 300 so we can better visualize the data, and also adjust the major interval. We can also control the start and the sweep angles. The default is 225 for the start angle and 270 for the sweep angle. Let's see what happens when we adjust these angles. The start angle tells me where on the screen the angle should begin. So if we set this to 0, you'll see it adjusts the gauge for the low value to be at the top of the screen. The sweep angle determines how far around the gauge the low to high intervals should go. So, for example, if we only want to use half of the gauge, we can set it to 180, and you can see the change reflected on our gauge. These are all just ways to customize and build out whatever it is you're trying to visualize with your gauges. The color field will change the color of the needle. And you can also set a transparent background, which removes the gray background from the gauge. While the visible box allows me to keep the gauge on the application, but not have it be visible. Many of these settings are universal for the different types of gauges you will encounter with your applications. For example, similar to the value box, for a circular gauge we have the ability to set limits. And multiple limits can be added to a gauge. Let's go ahead and we'll turn off the transparent background, and we'll minimize our circular gauge. And the next gauge I want to discuss is the donut gauge. Again, as soon as we drag it onto our screen, we are presented with the source tag picker. Let's use the same temperature tag. You will notice many similarities in the properties for the donut gauge. One thing that the circular gauge offers that the donut gauge does not is the major interval setting for scaling. Also, sweep angles and start angles are unique to the circular gauge. We do have the ability to change the fill for our donut gauge as well as set limits. We can change the color of our fill to this blue color. And now let's set some limits so you can see some of the variations and the different ways we can deal with setting limits within a donut gauge. This box determines whether the limit range is visible. And here's where we set the value for our limits. First, I want to change my scale max to 300. So now, when the temperature gets above 215, it will show in this red color. And if it dips below that limit, it will show as the blue color. Depending on the type of data that you're viewing, you can get very creative with the donut gauge and setting various limits. Now the last gauge to cover is the linear gauge. So let's go ahead and we'll make our donut gauge a little smaller. And we'll bring a linear gauge onto our screen. Now the linear gauge has some different properties compared to a circular gauge and a donut gauge. But remember, it is always important, no matter what gauge you're using, to have a proper scale max and scale min set. We'll change the major interval. It just helps clean up the gauge a little bit. Now, one unique setting is regarding the display option. You can choose between standard, fill, and cutaway. In the standard display, no matter the width of the gauge, the fill bar stays the same dimension. Now, if we switch it to fill, we keep the scale and we can adjust the thickness of the bar based on the width. With the cutaway option, the scale goes away and we retain the ability to adjust the thickness of the bar. Let's leave it on fill, which is the most commonly applied property for the linear gauge because it does offer the most versatility and allows you the ability to retain the scale. We also have the option to choose the orientation of the linear gauge. Automatic adjusts the orientation based on how we drag and arrange it on the screen. Vertical and horizontal automatically lock the orientation. So as you can see, the circular gauge, donut gauge, and linear gauge are all very useful. It can help you display various types of data on your applications.